From the divers that never left the caves they died in, to evil mill workers that continue to torment the living, some of the stories from Wookey Hole's history seem to be straight out of a horror movie. Shadows flit in the corner of your eyes, sounds emanate from the deepest recesses of the chambers, and the million-year-old past is very much alive and waiting. Come and sit by me as we get into the ancient history and terrifying hauntings of Wookey Hole. Are you ready to dive? Hello friend, how's your day been today? Are you doing good? Are you staying hydrated? Drink that water, I know you haven't had a drink today. If you're new around here, hi, welcome. I am Claire and I am a lover of all things morbid, mysterious and macabre. I've spent hours and hours absolutely enthralled in ghost hunting TV shows, but you know what I love more than night vision footage and EVPs? I love the history behind a paranormal encounter, the origins of urban legends, and those real, raw, personal ghost stories that people experience like just when they're never expecting it. And like, boom, ghost. So that's what we're gonna do. Every week we sit down and swap ghost stories like a good old sleepover. So if that is your scene, I would highly recommend subscribing so that you never miss one of our chats. So today's story, it involves a very old legend and a major tourist attraction in the UK, so there were plenty of like different sources that I could draw on. The book, Somerset Folktales by Sharon Jackstees, Haunted Somerset by John Garland, and even Extreme Hauntings by Paul Adams and Eddie Brazil. Like, these books in particular were brilliant for a lot of the history. This book especially, like, it had a big section on the caves and it helped fill in a little bit more of the history and some of the specific hauntings that I hadn't heard anywhere else, so that was pretty cool. I also need to shout out the Haunted History Chronicles podcast, who did a brilliant interview with Wookey Hole General Manager Chris Goodchild. And they talked a little bit more about like the history and hauntings of the caves and the paper mill. And as always, I will leave links below in the description to all of my sources so that if you want to get your learning on and find out a little bit more, you can. So come sit by me, grab your snacks and your water, and we will get into it. I feel like if you were a kid in the UK and you went on holiday, you'd have probably at some point gone to Wookey Hole. Like, it was one of those places where if you say the name to anyone, people will just go like, oh yeah, I absolutely love that place as a kid. And I mean, I am one of those people. We used to go down to Somerset on holiday quite a lot, and along with Cheddar Gorge, because they've got loads of caves there too, Wookey Hole was one of those places that I would always like ask my parents if we could go and visit. And I really didn't expect there to be so much information on this place, but so much has happened here that we are going to get all the way into, so strap in because it is a juicy one. And so if you don't know, Wookey Hole is the name given to a tourist attraction that sits in the village of Wookey in Somerset. And it consists of the Wookey Hole Caves and actually a paper mill as well. And there are a bunch of other things on the site. There's like a circus and a bunch of fiberglass dinosaurs and like all sorts. Like, it is the most fun place to go to if you're a kid. And the caves and mill are both really important and apparently super haunted locations. So I'm gonna chunk it up and we're gonna talk about the caves first and then we'll do the mill, just because there is so much to say. So the Wookey Hole Caves are a series of limestone caves that were basically eroded into the Mendip Hills by the River Axe that runs through it. And this is a process that has been going on for millions of years. These caves are super old, and they actually did like radioactive age testing on one of the stalactites, and they found that it was 500,000 years old. And there has actually been archaeological evidence found within the caves that shows that humans have been using the caves for like a shelter and whatnot for 50,000 years. Which is insane. And the thing about Wookey Hole Caves is that because the River Axe like basically eroded it and created it, it's super susceptible to how much rainfall we have. So if they have like a ridiculous amount of rainfall, some of the cave chambers will actually flood and it might unearth like even more prehistoric tools and like bones and things. So who knows what they might find at any point. They might have like this huge archaeological discovery like next week. So Wookey Hole Cave, that's a bit of a name, right? So the word Wookey, that's apparently a Celtic word for cave. Hole is a Saxon word for cave, and obviously cave means cave. So it could be that Wookey Hole Cave translates to cave, cave, cave. An alternative explanation for its unique name is that Wookey could be derived from an Old English word, wokkig, which means animal trap. Now this one is pretty interesting because at some point in its history, hyenas actually lived here. And they would basically hunt prey by herding them to the top of the Mendip Hill and driving them off the hill. So they would like fall off the cliff, like where the entrance to the Wookey Hole Cave is, and obviously die. So the cave itself has so much history throughout the thousands of years. Archaeologists have found both prehistoric human and animal bones in the cave, including like reindeer, mammoth, and even woolly rhino. They also found a whole bunch of bones from those hyenas in one of the caves while they were digging out like the canal that runs through the valley. So this whole area was so important for shelter and hunting for like both humans and animals back then. And it still remained just as useful through the years. The Romans were close by, like mining lead around here, and the Saxons and Normans, they were fighting their like horrific battles in the area. So it's no surprise that along with prehistoric bones and like flint tools, they often find things like pottery and Roman coins like washing out of the caves. But it's not just shelter that the caves had been used for back in the day. There's also been evidence from the cave that kind of points to the fact that Chamber 4 was actually a Celtic burial ground. Like there have been human bones and things washing through the river and down into the village below for years, so surely there must have been like something to that theory, right? I mean, the only other option was that the River Axe was actually the river to the underworld, and which is what some people believe like way back in the day, because it looks like the river originates from like deep underground. So I mean, we can see where they're coming from. Like the natural conclusion to this would be that it's just like washing up all of these bones from out of the underworld, right? Yeah. Makes sense. But actually, the burial ground theory was confirmed in 1973 when Bristol's Speleological Society, that is so difficult to say, they went a-digging, and the evidence was overwhelming. They found a bunch of bones that confirmed, yes, the Celts most likely used this as a burial ground to honour their dead and lay them to rest. And that's why pretty much any time the area gets like a lot of rainfall and the caves get flooded, there'll usually be a whole load more bones that show up. Like even as recent as October 2020, a diver called Michael Thomas and his team did a big dive after a flood and came up with a bunch of remains. So I don't think the people that are buried there are resting in peace anymore, you know, like they're getting washed up all the time. So along with the cave obviously being like super old, with really interesting things being found all the time, it's also got a few supernatural legends tied to it. The most famous legend is of course the Witch of Wookey Hole. And I mean, this story has a bit of everything. We got spooky, we got romance, we got a bit of good versus evil. Like, no wonder it's kept us captivated for literal centuries. So there isn't just one version of this story. With a legend as old as this one, there are bound to have like a few new details popping up as people embellish it and like pass it down. But we're gonna stick with what seems to be like the most popular story. It's the one that's on the official Wookey Hole website, so that's the one we're gonna go for. So the very first time that the witch's story was written down was in 1470 by a guy called William of Worcester, who was a chronicler. So he's just like trotting around the place, like writing things down for like history, you know? And he must have done a good job, as fast forward a couple of hundred years to 1694, the witch is still being mentioned, and now she's not just any old witch. She is the old witch of Wookey Hole. And like even her dog got a shout out too. And so let's get into the actual story. So, 1,000 years ago, there was this woman who lived in the Wookey village near to the caves. And she was gorgeous, like absolutely stunning. So it's no wonder that she'd bagged herself like quite a dashing young man. And so this couple, they were in love, they were doing cute couple things, which back in the day probably just meant trying to survive from one day to the next, when our girl went and contracted this horrific disease that disfigured her face. So this guy, our Prince Charming, turns out he wasn't really into the whole in sickness and in health deal, and he basically said thanks but no thanks and bailed on her, which I mean like exceptionally rude. So you can imagine this woman has this horrific disease, this is like 1,000 years ago, they have no idea what's going on. She's just lost the man of her dreams. I'm gonna guess the other villagers were probably a bit like avoiding her, maybe, like they don't want to catch anything. So she leaves the village and decides to start living in the Wookey Hole Cave. And she's lost everything. Her looks, her boyfriend, probably the entire community. She's salty. She's mad at life, to say the least. She was brewing all of these potions, trying to like fix her face and regain her beauty, but she never forgot how she was crossed. Seething. Would not let it go. Time goes by, she's playing ancient alchemist, trying to still restore her beauty. It ain't happening. During that time, her ex, he obviously moves on and gets engaged to another beautiful young girl. And I mean, your life expectancy was about 15 minutes back then, so like, you gotta move quick. So he did. Witchy in the Wookey Hole, She learns the news, not pleased at all. She actually puts a curse on the engagement, and some stories say that they ended up breaking up. Others say that his young fiancée was killed, leaving the man heartbroken. Either way, he ends up moving to Glastonbury to live out the rest of his days as a monk. Decides, like, you know what, I'm done with women. One got disfigured, one potentially died or left me. Clearly God is trying to give me a message here. Time goes on, our witch lady, she's just getting more and more bitter at the world. Clearly her looks just like aren't coming back, and the locals, they're not fans. Anytime something went wrong in the village, like bad crops, like you're missing a sock, she got the blame for it. Stories started to circulate around that she was actually starting to lure young couples into the caves where she would kill and eat them. Yikes, bit of an escalation. So the villagers, they eventually had enough, like years had gone by at this point. The village just wasn't a great place to be under this witch who may or may not have been cursing everyone. So the villagers reached out to the abbot at Glastonbury Abbey to sort of lend them a hand. Who does the abbot send? A dude called Father Bernard. And who is Father Bernard? Drumroll please. Mr. Heartbreaker himself, the witch's ex-boyfriend, all grown up into a monk. Father Bernard got into a bit of an argument with the witch at the entrance to the cave. Oh my god, to be a fly on the wall for that argument. He was telling her that she needed to leave. She can't be going around cursing people anymore. Why can't we all just be adults about this? Like, you know. She was having none of it, so she quote unquote fled deeper into the caves, but really she just wanted to get Father Bernard into the dark, where she could have more control over the situation. Like, those caves are her domain. She knows them better than anyone else. He follows her, but this boy is armed, okay? He's got a crucifix and his holy water, like nothing else you need. It's pitch black in the caves, but he can hear her like cackling about. So he just starts spraying his holy water about, like the original spray and pray method, you know. But what do you know? It actually works. Some of the holy water hits the witch and she starts screaming before it all goes silent. Turns out the holy water had turned the witch into stone. A stone that, funnily enough, you can now actually see in chamber 1 of the caves, which is known as the witch's kitchen. Like, that's a pretty cool story, right? This legend has been passed down since 1470. Like, everyone in the area knows of the legend of the old witch of Wookey Hole Caves. But in 1788, they were starting to think that they were getting much too modern for such a fairy tale. And a guy called Reverend Shaw, he just dismissed the legend as like, just silly tales. But another reverend came along and was like, nah, it's true, I spoke to the cave guide. The cave guide had apparently told him that the witch had been turned to stone while she was cooking a child that she had freshly stolen from the village that morning. And that the guide's grandfather apparently remembered the old woman, saying that yeah, she was a nasty piece of work. She would maim cattle, she would bewitch young maids, and torture old people with cramps and twitches. Which, I mean, like, okay, great for the second reverend, like keeping the story alive and all. But that guide's granddad would have had to have been like a few hundred years old to have been able to remember as far back as when the witch apparently lived in the caves, like 1,000 years ago. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Fast forward to 1912, when an archaeologist called Herbert Balch, who was actually the first to go like all Indiana Jones in the caves, he was doing a bit of digging and he came across an ancient skeleton that was buried in a shallow grave. Next to it, the remains of 2 goats, a bowl, a dagger, and some like other interesting bits and pieces. And I will just say though, like, it seems like a super convenient conclusion to the story, doesn't it? Like, the remains of the quote-unquote witch that lived in the cave. The reality though is never quite that convenient. The remains were studied and found that it was actually the skeleton of a man, probably a goat herder, owing to like the 2 goats that were found with him. But I mean, that's not to say that there wasn't a witch living in that cave at another point in time and that maybe like her bones haven't been found, or maybe they've already like washed out, we don't know. And so that is the story of the witch of Wookey Hole Cave, which I'm going to keep coming back to because she is such an important part of this place's history. So how on earth did Wookey Hole go from a hole in the cliff with like cool bones and things to a major attraction with something nuts like 25,000 visitors a year? So obviously the story of the witch hell, like duh. And so people have been paying to go and look around the caves for years. Because even aside from the witch story, they're still amazing to look at, like with all the rock formations and the stalagmites and the stalactites. And you know, the best way that I found to help remember like which way they are Stalagmites might reach the ceiling one day. They just need to grow up big and strong. And stalactites hang tight to the ceiling so they don't fall. I don't know, it works for me. In 1927, a man called Wing Commander Gerard Hodgkinson owned the Wookey Hole estate. And he began to develop what was called the Witch's Lair back then, which was the beginnings of the tourist attraction that it is today. So obviously, like, heavily playing on the witch's story, but it also meant that people could go around and have a look at the caves. And back then, only chamber 1, 2, and 3 were accessible to visitors. Like, that was all you could see, that was all you could walk around. Since then, it's been owned by Madame Tussauds, who managed it in the 70s, before it was brought by a guy called Jerry Cottle, whose family actually still own and run it today. So throughout the years, they've made a couple of like artificial tunnels and added bits onto the estate to make it like a real visitor attraction, but it all basically started with the caves. So we already know a little bit about the cave system itself, and also that it's not actually been fully explored yet, but the chambers that we do know about are still really interesting. So first of all, the chambers are numbered, which makes it super easy. So once you enter the caves, you are in chamber 1. This is known as the Witch's Kitchen, and it's where you'll find the famous stalagmite that's weirdly witch-shaped with her bonnet and like hooked nose and everything. On the smaller one next to it, that's supposedly her loyal canine companion, her dog Familiar, man's best friend, even in stone apparently. And in the Witch's Kitchen chamber, there is also what is known as the Witch's Chimney. I feel like there's a little bit of a theme with the naming logic going on here. What's interesting about the Witch's Chimney is that there are like little scratch marks all near it, and for the longest time they just thought it was graffiti, so they kind of just like dismissed it. Because the rock is fairly soft in that area, like it's fairly easy to carve into it, so it's just kids messing about, right? Apparently not. Apparently, these marks were studied by our pals at the British Speleological Society, getting better at saying that, and they were found to be what was called witches' marks. And these are basically like ritual protection marks that were done in the 16th and 17th century to ward off evil spirits. So I'm guessing someone did them to like ward off the evil spirit of the witch. And so if you walk a little bit further down, you get into chamber 2, which is also known as the Great Hall because it's so tall, it's like 70 feet high. And I googled things that were 70 feet high to try and give you an idea of like just how big this chamber is. And it gave me the weirdest comparisons. This chamber is 4 giraffes high, like stacked on top of each other, or the span of 5 Japanese spider crabs. Because we all know that very common unit of measurement. And I think that just gives you more of an indication of how big Japanese spider crabs are rather than like how big the chamber is, I don't know. A bit further on, and we get to chamber 3, which is known as the Witch's Parlour. And it's also where you can get married. Like, could you even imagine how incredible that would be to get married in the cave? Like, hello, wedding photos? They would have been incredible. Do you think that with 7 days to go to my wedding, I can completely change the plan and get married in a cave instead? No, don't do that. So we've spoken about cave 4 already, and that's where the ancient Celtic burial ground is, and this is kind of where it gets a little bit wet. I mean, the entire cave system is wet, like it was formed by a river, but you get what I mean. They have blasted through and made artificial tunnels to allow visitors to walk through some bits, but others are only accessible if you've got a wetsuit and a pretty good idea of how to go cave diving. So chamber 9 has become like this checkpoint for cave divers coming to Wookey Hole, because this is usually where you will start your cave diving from. And so the furthest that we've got within the cave system is to chamber 25, also cheerfully known as the Chamber of Gloom. And until chamber 25, the cave is pretty like horizontal. So you end up with some chambers having water in them, and then some like air, so some like you can sort of walk around a little bit. But it is great for adding in those checkpoints for divers, so they know they only have to dive for this long before they get to a chamber with air in, basically. But at chamber 25, the cave starts to go down, and the rest of the caves that we know of are completely submerged, and that's as far as we've got on the exploration front, because they haven't even reached the end of the cave system. Like, they have no idea how far Wookey Hole Caves go. But the divers are always hoping to sort of like push and explore that little bit further. One other area of the caves, which I think is absolutely brilliant, is the cheese tunnel. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It's a tunnel with cheese. Like, they've just got shelves and shelves of the stuff, which they age in the cave 200 feet underground to soak up all that cavey flavour. So if you're there as a tourist, like wandering around the caves, like, oh yes, that's very nice, stalagmites, you exit to the gift shop and now buy some cheese. I'd be all over that, to be honest. But obviously it's not just the tourists that love visiting the caves. Wookey Hole has had a super long history with cave diving. Them divers just love it there. And the caves are actually a really significant place for cave diving in general. I mean, number one, it's actually the birthplace of cave diving. The very first cave dive took place here on the 14th of July 1935 by a guy called Graham Balcombe and the fabulously named Penelope Mossy Powell. These two absolute maniacs walked along the riverbed from Chamber 3 straight into Chamber 4. And get this, they were decked out in heavy deep sea diving equipment. Not really the recommended get-up for going cave diving. And can I also just add that, like, well, yeah, it's rockstar to go and do this thing for the first time ever, but to go and basically just walk off into the unknown. Like, you don't know if there are any, like, weird crevices or, like, holes in the floor or, like, currents to take you off your feet, or even if it's just a damn dead end. But then to also do it in these massive, huge, cumbersome suits that are absolutely not designed for what you're using them for. I think the health and safety officer would have fainted if they'd had them back then. So they'd successfully completed the first cave dive and made history, which was epic in itself, but Graham wasn't done there. He actually went and pushed further ahead, reaching Chamber 7 a little later on that year on another dive. And with some new oxygen equipment, fresh out of World War II, by 1948, him and his team were high-fiving all the way to Chamber 9. And so I'm just going to paint a picture for you about this chamber. It's 30 meters high, you've got emerald waters that are 20 meters deep, with walls that are glistening in red and shining with like these flowstone calcite formations. It's basically like the VIP lounge of Wookey Hole Caves. And it became like the place for cave divers for like the next 3 decades. Eventually, they actually blasted through and made a man-made tunnel so that all of the divers could use Chamber 9 as like their starting point. And that's where they still start from today. Because modern cave divers are still all about that place. Because it's such a complex cave diving system, it's a brilliant place for training up divers on how to navigate like really tricky caves. But if you don't fancy going that far, you can actually book onto like a little adventure thing where you can like abseil and squeeze through rocks and do all that sort of stuff just without the super dangerous like cave diving bit. But be real with me, honestly, for a second. Is there anything more terrifying than trying to squeeze yourself through muddy tunnels in the pitch black, underground, with tons and tons of earth above you? Like, I firmly believe that cave divers are just a completely different breed of people. And even as a training ground for cave divers, it's still a ridiculously complicated and dangerous cave system, as unfortunately 2 divers have found out over the years. The first tragic incident would happen about 19 years after the first ever cave dive in 1949. So it's the 9th of April, 1949, and we've got 2 divers going for a swim in the caves, a man named Robert Davies and James Ingram Marriott. And James, like, he's not a rookie technically, like he's an ex-Marine with about 500 hours of dive time under his belt. However, cave diving is a completely different beast and he's not quite as experienced in it. So it's 1949, this is before they've blasted the tunnel through to Chamber 9, and these guys have actually dived to Chamber 9 without a hitch, like everything went fine. They'd begun their dive back out of Chamber 9 into Chamber 3, and so they'd kind of like have to follow the guide rope to make sure they didn't get lost in any of the tunnels. Ingram Marriott was leading and Davies was following like right along behind him. But it was the journey back where things just went super wrong. I mean, I guess it's like when you reach the summit of Mount Everest, like you think the hard part's over, right? When in reality, most people die on the way down. Like it was kind of like that, I guess. Like you're on the home stretch on the way back. So there they were following the guide rope back to Chamber 3, Ingram Marriott's in front of Davies. Everything's going well, it's all peachy right now. But the cave kind of just flipped a switch, and Davies was completely plunged into darkness. Like, you look at the cave as a tourist, and it looks gorgeous. Like, you've got all the different coloured lights, they're lighting up all like the different chambers and everything. But in reality, for the divers, and especially in 1949, there were no pretty lights. So Davies, he thinks like his headlight has just like upped and died on him, like he's just in complete darkness. In reality, he just had like a massive glob of mud like covering the entire light, but it's still the same outcome. He is currently underwater in the pitch black cave with no light at all. But you just can't panic. There's nothing you can do. You've just got to keep moving forward. He'd still got a hold of the guide rope, so all you can do is just keep pushing on through into Chamber 3. So that's what he did. He couldn't get a hold of Ingram Marriott in the front, so he's just assumed that he's already gone up and he's already chilling at the end point. So Davis just stayed calm, keep on trucking, keep on following the guide rope. and he eventually reached chamber 3 totally fine. He's looking around for his mate James Ingram Marriott, probably going to go dig on him for leaving him in the dark back there, but James is absolutely nowhere to be found. He's not in chamber 3, which is exactly where he should be. He was ahead of Davies. Right, that's weird. Where the hell is James? They start looking, and it doesn't take them long to find James's body facing upstream, as if he was trying to push ahead. The real kicker about the whole thing, a faulty pressure gauge had betrayed him. He'd run out of oxygen without any warning. Ugh. It's just gut-wrenching, isn't it? And that's the thing about cave diving. Like, you can be the most experienced guy in the world. Like, if you have a gear malfunction on the day, or Mother Nature just decides, like, today is the day, there is literally nothing you can do. It's game over. And it's happened time and time again. I mean, just look at how many YouTube videos there are out there about various different cave diving trips gone wrong. There was another victim that the Wookey Hole Caves would claim though, this time in 1981. Because on the 14th of November, a 22-year-old man called Keith Potter would decide to spend his Saturday going cave diving in the Wookey Hole Caves. And he had along with him some mates from the Oxford University Cave Club, like all super experienced divers. But it would turn out to be Keith's last ever dive. And when I was researching this story, like, it's just so tragic. Like, obviously it's sad when anyone gets into a tragic accident, but it's just made so much worse when they're so young and when they have such an unbelievably bright future ahead of them. So we actually lost a family friend earlier this year, and he was exactly like Keith. He was in his 20s, he had a ridiculously bright future career-wise. Like, he was gonna change the world, and he was just all around just a good person. And he passed away doing what he loved. And I'm gonna quote a Nickelback song before I get too emotional, and this song was actually in his funeral service, and it's that each day is a gift and not a given right. So please, live today like it is your last day, because one day it will be. And never be afraid to follow your dreams and ambitions. If that's what you want to do, don't let anything stop you. Do the thing that sets your soul on fire today. Start the YouTube channel, build your podcast, grow the business, quit the job, ask the girl out. Just do the things that you're too afraid to do, but that you want the most in this world. And so now I have significantly changed the tone of this video entirely. Let's talk about that awful day in November 1981 and what happened to Keith Potter, even though he was doing what he loved more than anything in this world. And what I want you to know about Keith before this is that he was an incredibly talented diver. He was described as having this limitless enthusiasm for cave diving and exploration. But what made him exceptional was his ability to stay completely calm under pressure, especially when he was like exploring like new undiscovered cave chambers and things. And I mean, if you think about it, it would be like so easy when you're exploring a new place that humans haven't set foot in like thousands of years, like if they ever even have, just to get completely carried away and forget about basic safety, like keeping your wits about you kind of thing. But not Keith. Super calm when he needed to be, super level-headed. And he was a key member of the Oxford University Cave Club, where he was studying medicine on a scholarship, just to give you an idea of the kind of guy that Keith was. But just as an example of Keith's cave diving skill, the club went on an expedition to Pozo del Zitu in Spain 1980, so the year before. And he took part in a bunch of pushing trips, which is like the most terrifying thing ever. It's when you literally push yourself through like tiny little cracks or passageways, like, you know, the most claustrophobic thing ever. He even did this and kept his sense of humor intact. He was recommending in the write-up afterwards that you should take extra crotches and limbs with you if you fancy caving there yourself. And the reason for this is because during that trip he injured his knee, which turned into an abscess, and he suffered like loads of friction sores on his groin. And he was quoted in the write-up as saying, "I like mine mutilated." So he definitely like kept his sense of humor about all of it. But without Keith, they probably wouldn't have reached the terminal sump, which I'm guessing is like the deepest part of the cave. He carried on when others were ready to turn back, and even when he'd reached the terminal sump, he was tired, cold, dripping wet. He spent hours looking for a bypass. So he was an extremely capable diver, studying for a medical degree to become a consultant physician. He was just one of those people that you can just call a good egg. He was a good person. And so in David Rose and Richard Gregson's book, Beneath the Mountains, they talked a little bit about the story about what happened that day at Wookey Hole. So it was a Saturday, November 1981, when Keith was back home at his parents' in Wedmore, which is like a 20-minute drive, like super close. So he decided to go caving in Wookey Hole. And because of just like how close his parents lived to the caves, he'd gone diving and exploring there like many times before. It was just a Saturday afternoon for him. He was with a group of experienced divers, like everything was fine. Keith had been attempting to dive the sump between the 9th and the 19th chambers, which in fairness is a long but now like fairly well-travelled way. And Keith had successfully been through it before, like no problem. There are 2 routes through this part, so Keith set off through the lower, deeper passage, and a guy called Martin Farr, who is one of the best cave divers in the country, he followed along afterwards, taking the shallower but more difficult route. And when I say Martin Farr was one of the best, like, he was one of the best. He had been the guy that had broken records for how far through Wookey Hole Caves he had gotten. Like, he knew this place. But this is where it all went wrong for Keith. Farr reported that once he'd gotten through the shallow passage that he was diving through, he saw Keith like they were right at the very end of the flooded section, which is like 10 feet of water. But he was in sight of airspace, like he was so close. But when Martin got closer, he realised just how wrong things had gone. Keith was floating completely motionless in that last bit of water. The mouthpiece to his air tank was just like floating free, like not over his mouth where it should have been. Martin rushed over to Keith, and by that point other divers were like starting to come through the passageway too. So they were all rushing to help. They dragged him up onto this dry spot in the chamber and tried to resuscitate him for an hour, but it was already too late. And so because he was like effectively doing the part of the dive on his own, they'll never really know for sure what happened. Some of his mates think that he might have passed out from the cold because he was kind of known as like not having the best wetsuit, but he was wearing 2 that day, like it shouldn't have been a problem. Rob Parker was another diver on that trip that day, like very experienced guy. He thought maybe Keith had tried to swim too fast uphill and basically like tired himself out. But then instead of resting and like taking a break to catch his breath, maybe he just like made the decision to go for it, thinking that he was almost at the end. And I mean, he was so close to the end, but just not quite close enough. In reality, we will never truly know what happened to Keith. Only that a young guy with the world opening up ahead of him tragically lost his life way too soon. His friends decided that they wanted to do something to commemorate Keith, to like remember his life and his achievements. And although Keith had been pretty critical of like commemorative plaques to signify when a cave diver has died, his mates wanted to do something for him. Keith's argument about it had always been that like caves are permanent, and while we as humans are transitionary. And I mean, I understand, like these caves have been here for millions of years. The humans that go caving in them and lose their lives in them aren't even a speck on their timeline. In the end, his friends decided to put the plaque at the bottom of Z2's like steep entrance climb, which meant that it would have only been seen by like cave divers and not like random people passing by. The plaque read that Pozzo del Z2 was 1,139 meters and that Keith Potter, the first man to reach the bottom of that cave, had died in Wookey Hole on the 14th of November 1981. And could you just imagine going that way? How James and Keith died? Like it would have just been horrific. Like both of them, they weren't newbies. They were experienced cave divers. They chose to go diving that day, doing what they've done tens, if not hundreds of times before. Just on that day, things just didn't shake out the way they were supposed to. So they both died in what I can imagine would be absolute blind fear, knowing that unless someone comes and saves your ass right now, or you magically find your way into a chamber with air right this second, it's game over. Like that is some pretty powerful energy. Now you couple that with the fact that the cave was used as an ancient burial ground and add in the legend of the witch that goes back hundreds of years. Like you can see why people believe that it is so haunted, which is exactly the case for Wookey Hole Caves. So there have been some like weird noises in the caves for years, like sounding like disembodied moans and footsteps following behind you. Maybe these are echoes of paranormal activity, or maybe they're just like water hitting different parts of the caves and like echoing around the chambers. Visitors that are on guided tours of the cave can sometimes feel like a nudge on their shoulder, like something unseen is trying to get their attention. And I can assure you that that is not part of the tour. Like there are no paid actors. I mean there are, but like not to go around like touching the guests. What's a little harder to explain away are the dark shadows and misty figures that you see out of the corner of your eye. And then there are the stories of the cave divers. So one story came from the general manager, Chris Goodchild, in his interview with the Haunted History Chronicles podcast. He said that on one occasion, a visitor was like walking through the caves on kind of like a self-guided tour thing, which you can do. There are guided tours, and then you can also just like go walking around on your own if you want to. And this tourist, they were just like wandering around when they saw a cave diver. Okay, like nothing really out of the ordinary at this point. Like Wookey Hole make it very clear that they are a big location for cave divers. They've got a bunch of cave cave diving equipment in the museum, like, no big, right? This cave diver, the tourist kind of looks at them and they seem to be like looking around them a little bit confused. Like they're not really sure where in the caves they are. Almost like you've kind of like dived into the wrong bit and now you've come out in a weird place and now you're all sort of like turned around kind of thing. The thing is, as the visitor got closer to the diver actually turned to look at them and they actually seemed to like notice them. The diver said hi and kind of like spoke to the visitor as if they were sort of like an honorary tour guide of the place. Like clearly knew it very well and directed the visitor on like how to get out of the caves, like which way they needed to go. But okay, thank you very much, like very helpful. The visitor made it out of the caves no issue, and as they exited the cave, they walked past another staff member. And like in passing, the visitor just mentioned to the staff member like, oh, could you make sure that you pass on my thanks to the cave diver that's in the cave today? Like he was really helpful, he showed me the right way out and all of that. The staff member kind of looked at the visitor a little bit funny, like, there's no cave divers in the caves today. There aren't any dives scheduled at all. So that's pretty weird. And it is said that James Ingram Marriott, the diver to pass away in 1949, does still haunt the cave. I'm kind of thinking that if it was James, he would kind of be in that like oldie-worldy cave diving equipment that would have been pretty out of place. Like the visitor would have noticed. So maybe it was Keith, like coming back to help out and find out how he went so wrong. Chris also went on to say that out of all of the potentially creepy places in the entire cave system, it's Chamber 3 that gives him the creeps. And this guy has been working at Wookey Hole for years. Like he can walk through the caves at night with the lights off like absolutely no problem. But it's just something about Chamber 3 just gives him like a super weird, eerie feeling. And of course, we can't talk about Wookey Hole Caves being haunted without mentioning the legend of the witch once again. So apparently the ghost of the witch has been witnessed in the caves, but I couldn't really find anything else on that. Like that was all that was sort of said, was that yeah, the ghost is there. Like there wasn't really anything else to it. So I'm gonna guess that probably someone just added that onto the story to like make it a bit more juicy. I don't know. I'm more than happy to be proved wrong. Like if you have a story about the ghost of the Wookey Hole witch, please leave it down in the comments below. Prove me wrong. And so I've chatted for ages about the caves, but I don't think I've actually mentioned this, which is actually pretty cool. The caves at Wookey Hole have actually been featured on TV. More specifically, Doctor Who used the caves as their set for an alien planet when they were filming Revenge of the Cyberman with Tom Baker back in 1974. So a guy called Michael Bryant was asked to direct one of the stories for the 12th season of Doctor Who, which was actually the first to feature Tom Baker as the Doctor. I absolutely loved Tom Baker. I was first introduced to him as Captain Baker in Fort Bayard. Does anyone remember that show? So for this storyline, Revenge of the Cyberman, Bryant decided that he wanted something a little different than the usual like stone quarries that the BBC normally went for when they were trying to shoot on a location that looks kind of like otherworldly. He had a very fond childhood memory of, you guessed it, Wookey Hole. The way the chambers are laid out and like all of the stalagmites and stalactites, like, I mean, you can see it, right? It looks a lot more alien than a man-made quarry. So on the 12th of November, 1974, he set out on a little like scout out mission to Wookey Hole to see what the location was like which scenes he could use where and whatnot. He'd gone in the day when the place was open to the public, so obviously it was busy with people and there were some bits that like he couldn't get into. He spoke to the manager though, and the manager guy said like, you know what, come back later once we're closed, I'll let you in and then you can sort of like see everything you need to see then. And so that's what they did. Michael came back once they were closed for the day and the cave manager locked the entrance and exits so that no one would disturb the director while he was like planning out the shooting schedule. Obviously they left the lights on too, like he wasn't doing a ghost investigation. So there he was, putting together his plan, and it took him a few hours. He'd actually come across what looked like some ancient arrowheads with a stone scraper, which wasn't unusual in Wookey Hole. Like as we've covered, things washed up from the rising and falling water like all of the time. But he decided they were pretty cool and he put them into his bag with him to take home. By 11 p.m. he was done though, and he was just like packing up and getting ready to leave. He looked up and saw someone walking towards him, thinking like, oh, it must have been the cave manager. He probably wants to go home now, like it's 11 o'clock. But it wasn't. It was the figure of a diver dressed in old-fashioned caving gear. The cave diver passed by him in the shadows and continued straight into one of the first underground pools. Huh? That was weird. Cave manager said I was alone, but okay. I mean, Wookey Hole is often used by cave divers. So it must just be one of those. Yeah, no. When the director met up with the cave manager, he confirmed that Michael Bryant was the only person in the caves. There was no cave dives scheduled for that night. So cave diver, in old-fashioned diving gear, could it have been the spirit of James Ingram Marriott, who had lost his life in the caves in 1949? But the story wasn't done there. On the 18th of November 1974, like the next week, the film crew rolled into Wookey Hole to start filming. Almost immediately, weird things started happening. There were loads of things going wrong that caused like a bunch of delays. Things like crew members getting ill or like feeling claustrophobic. But then other more unexplained things, like equipment that had been completely fine on previous shoots, like completely breaking down. Like more than you think would be a normal amount of like, yeah, technology just does weird things kind of thing. But the activity really ramped up when one of Bryant's crew, an electrician, decided to raid the prop store and dress up the petrified remains of the Witch of Wookey Hole. And it's kind of like an unwritten rule that if you're down in the caves, you leave her alone. Like, she was apparently evil in real life. Is it worth messing around with her now? But this crew member just thought it would be hilarious to put a pointed hat and a black cloak on the stalagmite. Yeah, that would be a mistake. When the crew were filming a scene in the witch's parlour, Elizabeth Sladen, who played Sarah Jane Smith, was in a boat on the lake. Without any warning, this boat just went nuts. It sped out across the lake, completely out of control, and was heading towards the far wall. Elizabeth had no choice but to jump out of the boat before it slammed into the wall, and was saved by a stuntman, Terry Walsh, who had to jump in to save her from drowning. Later on that very day, the electrician that thought he was being so clever dressing the witch up, he fell off a ladder and broke his leg. This was all alongside like loads of things going wrong still, like loads of delays, loads of things not working as they should be when they'd been fine in rehearsals, like all of that. By the 22nd of November though, they'd finished at Wookey Hole and the crew rolled back out to London to finish filming in the studios. The rest of the filming would go completely fine, like without a hitch, but it seemed that maybe whatever entity had been causing things to go wrong on location wasn't quite done with Michael Bryant, the director. For weeks following the filming in Somerset, Michael just seemed to be unlucky. Like things would go wrong and he would just have like a bunch of personal problems going on. He started to put two and two together that all of this drama happened after he had brought home the ancient tools that he had found at Wookey Hole. Maybe something was unhappy about his little unauthorized souvenir. He unceremoniously dumped the tools in the dustbin where they would eventually have gone to landfill. Within a week, all of his personal drama resolved and he was just back to normal. Weird that. I don't know, like if I had been the entity, I don't know if I would have felt more angry about being thrown out in the rubbish. Or maybe there's like the ghost of a caveman wandering around a London landfill now? Who knows? But on a non-paranormal note, Doctor Who actually returned to Wookey Hole in 2009 with David Tennant filming his final story there, The End of Time. I'm sorry, I'm gonna put it out there. David Tennant was my favourite Doctor, very closely followed by Christopher Eccleston. Like there, I said it. And so I think that is just about everything that I wanted to say on Wookey Hole Caves. So much history, death, burials, like remains are still being found today. I'm honestly not surprised that people do think that the caves are so haunted. But if you're gonna go visit Wookey Hole, you don't just have the caves to go and look around, you also have the old paper mill. And so I am gonna give you like everything I know about the place. However, the problem with the mill is that it manufactured paper. And what do we know about paper? That's right, it burns. And that is exactly what happened. Apparently it's burned down a few times and they actually lost like a bunch of historical evidence that there's just no way to get back, which is a shame, but we move with what we've got. So there was actually records of a mill existing on the site in 1086 in the Doomsday Book, although that mill produced flour. But it would be the paper industry that would absolutely boom in Wookey Hole, with the first paper mill being established in 1610, and that's the year that they had the first documented lease for paper making on the site. And so the reason that this was the perfect place for a paper mill was because of the super clear, like fresh water that was running out of the caves. The River Axe, it was perfect for making paper. So the mill would just continue to grow from then on, and in the 19th century they'd built like this huge mill because it had like all the waterways to support it. However, one of the apparent many fires that would affect a lot of the mill happened on the 20th of April 1855. But it didn't stop the mill, they just like rebuilt it and got back to work. It was actually once one of the most important paper-making mills in Europe. And this paper, it was a process. It would take 3 months to go from boiling bits of rag to finished paper. So they were trying to churn out this paper as fast as possible, right? Especially during the Victorian times when industry is like really getting going. So this is where it apparently gets a little bit darker. Because like so many other factories and mills in the Victorian times, it quote unquote employed children. Because of their tiny little limbs, they could reach into the machines when they were still on and pull bits of rag out that got stuck or like try and fix them or whatever. So they wouldn't have to turn off the machines and like have to deal with downtime, because who wants to pay for that? And it went about as well as you can imagine it went. I couldn't find any evidence or records, but on the Haunted History Chronicles podcast, Chris Goodchild mentioned that it was probably likely that so many children would have been maimed, would have lost limbs because of this. And of course, other more unfortunate kids would have been crushed and killed if they were really unlucky. But it's just the price of progress, am I right? Well, basically over the years, the paper mill got dunder mifflin. Like the demand for paper just wasn't there, so they had to keep scaling back the work. In 1976, however, visitors to Wookey Hole were curious about the paper and wanted to see how it was made. Madame Two Swords now owned the place, like, you know, the one with all the waxworks. And so they brought a part of the mill back to life, creating the paper made at Wookey Hole to sell to the tourists. Nowadays, the mill building contains like a soft play area, you've got like a vintage penny arcade, and like a whole ass circus. And apparently more than a few ghosts. The mill is thought to be a super haunted location, and when you think about all of the deaths that potentially took place here, I mean, you can see why. Dark shadows are commonly seen throughout the mill, but worst of all really is that the disembodied cries of absolute agony can be heard. And these are super distinctive cries because they are the sound of children crying. Which is just sad when you put the history and the hauntings together. And there have been specific reports of the apparitions of children actually seen in the mill. One spirit of a young girl has been spotted roaming around the ground floor and the basement of the mill. And apparently another girl died at the mill while waiting for her mom to come and pick her up. So now she's been seen wandering around looking for her mother. But there is a more negative presence in the mill. In the mirror maze, there is a tall and extremely aggressive male entity that haunts the area. He absolutely hates people in his space and has been known to push people. The thing is, when paranormal investigators have made contact with this entity, he seems to have trouble communicating clearly. Like, he clearly has like some kind of learning difficulty, which obviously back then in the heyday of the mill, like, they wouldn't have been quite so understanding about people with learning difficulties. And they probably made his life hell, which wouldn't really have done much for his sunny disposition, you know? But it gets even worse. So the mill has super deep basements, and it's not really a place where people are allowed to go very often. But just before COVID, there was a documentary being filmed, and the crew were adamant that they were going to go down into this spooky basement. After literally a couple of minutes, the atmosphere down in the basement just went dark. One of the Wookey Hole staff members had to be helped out of the basement. She was so affected by whatever it was down there. There are stories of a mill manager, kind of like a foreman maybe, who apparently was an absolutely evil person in life. He was reported to have used the mill workers absolutely horrifically. By the way that Chris Goodchild explained it, he just sounded like this extremely nasty person in life that got away with all sorts of viciousness. So maybe he's come back in death. So that's about everything on the paper mill itself. There wasn't really a great deal out there, which is a shame, as it could have potentially been like a part 2 for this story, but you know, fire. We're not quite done with the Wookey Hole visitor attraction though, because there is one more place that seemed to be the centre of terrifying hauntings in the early 1900s. So back in 1927, when Wing Commander Gerard Hodgkinson was developing the Witch's Lair like tourist attraction, he was the one that sort of added the gardens leading up to the caves. He added the museums, the shops, the restaurants, like you get the idea. And there was a cottage on the estate that was rented out to a private tenant at the time. In 1947, the 80-year-old woman who had lived in the cottage for like almost 70 years, she passed away. Which is a shame, like, you know, she's been part of Wookey Hole for so long, like, it's very sad. But after she passed away, they decided, like, it shouldn't just sit there empty, like, let's open it up for another tenant. Now, she had lived in this place almost her entire life with no running water or electricity. Like, she would just be cruising around the cottage at night by candlelight. But they thought, okay, it's 1947, we should probably add in some mod cons. So they did up the cottage and added power and running water. But it was after these renovations weird things started happening. The first tenants to move in a year later, in 1948, were a young family, a husband and wife, and their 8-year-old son. For the first couple of months, everything seemed fine. They were settling into their new home, it was great. Until one night, the little boy ran down the stairs to his parents, looking absolutely terrified. He asked his mom, "Who is that old lady upstairs?" What? I have no idea what you mean, son. There is no old lady. No, he was adamant there was an old lady upstairs in his bedroom. She was wearing a cap and a white apron, and she was just standing there in his room. Okay, you're probably having a weird nightmare. Your brain's playing tricks on you, that sort of thing. So the mom went upstairs to check out the bedroom and to show him that there was nothing to be afraid of. She reached the top of the stairs and was about to go into the kid's bedroom when the full body apparition of the old woman walked across the landing. Funnily enough, after that, the boy refused to sleep on his own, and I'm guessing that the mom probably didn't have too much to say about that either. And this encounter seemed to kick off the activity in the cottage, as over the next few months, the family would hear disembodied footsteps going up and down the stairs, doors would fly open and slam shut with a ridiculous amount of force, and the electric lights would turn on and off just on their own. Oh, and the old lady? Yeah, she was spotted multiple times wandering around the cottage. It was said that she was always accompanied by a wave of intense cold, and the smell of a rotting body always followed her. Beautiful. The family didn't last too long. Eventually it all got too much for them and they moved out. But the same things were reported by every single tenant that moved into the cottage after them. Eventually, when it was clear that it just wasn't working, the Hodgkinson family changed up the cottage and the one that kind of joined to it. And at this point, it's in the early 1950s, Wookey Hole as a tourist attraction was booming, loads of business growth, and they needed to expand. So they took the haunted cottage and the cottage that joined it and they turned them into accommodation for the restaurant staff. Pretty quickly, staff would refuse to stay the night there. One employee was woken up in the middle of the night to see the apparition of the old woman emerge through one of the walls and then walk into the bedroom. So obviously, that freaked her out completely. The catering manager was getting a bit concerned that her staff were refusing to use the cottage because of all these reports of paranormal activity. And she was a complete skeptic. There is no such thing as ghosts. Listen, I'll stay there the night, I'll show you there's nothing going on, and then we can forget all about this. Stop your imagination running wild kind of thing. So she locked up for the night, she was completely on her own, and not long into it, she started to feel a little bit uneasy. Was she just letting the stories get to her? No, she is a rational woman. There is a rational explanation. Let's just go to bed and let's just try and get some sleep. She was not getting any sleep anytime soon. She claimed that she could hear disembodied whispers in the room with her, which is absolutely terrifying. Something you can't see is having a conversation while you're in bed. I mean, number one, rude, but also super creepy. So there were whispers and unexplained noises going on all around her. She just knew, she had that really strong feeling that she was absolutely not alone in this bedroom. She went and fetched the assistant catering manager and together both women searched the entire cottage. Please, can there be a rational explanation to all of this? Obviously there was nothing there. Somehow the catering manager decided to go back to bed and the assistant manager left. But just after 2 a.m, the manager woke up to the feeling of an icy cold, bony hand being placed on her shoulder. Obviously that freaked her out. She sat up in bed and slammed the light switch on for the bedside lamp. That's when she saw the figure of the old woman standing across from her bed, staring at her. The manager screamed in absolute horror as this apparition drifted through the floor and disappeared through the opposite wall. Funnily enough, she refused to stay in the cottage ever again and probably never poked fun at the staff members that refused to spend the night there. Throughout the next 2 years, more people would report seeing the apparition of the old woman, and paranormal activity continued to occur in the cottage for years. Seances were held at the cottage to see if they could contact the spirit of the old woman, but nothing helped. It was only when an exorcism was conducted in 1954, at the request of the Hodgkinson family, that the activity at the cottage finally came to an end. Elsewhere on the site, there's what used to be a gift shop and is now an ice cream parlour, which sells incredible ice creams, just FYI. They're amazing. That's also been known to have a ghostly encounter or two. So back with our pal Chris Goodchild, the general manager, when he was younger, he was closing up the gift shop for the night with another staff member, when just as they were about to close the door, a display of candles that were set up were launched across the room. And this wasn't like the door closing or like a gust of wind causing the candles to fall or anything like that. No, these babies were full on curled off the shelf and across the room. Funnily enough, they just closed the door and left. I mean, they just completely noped, which I 100% understand. I would have probably done the same. That right there is a daylight problem for when plenty of people are around. We will deal with it then. And so when you've got a site that has been used by humans for tens of thousands of years, and you add in the accidental deaths and the tragedies that happened both at the caves and in the mill, and add to the fact that basically any time the river floods, you're disturbing someone's last resting place, I think it would be weird if the place wasn't haunted as hell. But what do you think? Have you ever felt something in Wookey Hole, in the caves, or in the mill, or elsewhere? Please do let me know your thoughts and your stories down below. I absolutely love reading other people's ghosty experiences. I absolutely 100% believe that Wookey Hole is haunted. I've been a few times throughout the years, mainly when I was a kid, but I am hoping to go again in November time, which is going to be very interesting now that I've done all of this research, and I'm probably going to find out a bunch of new things that I will be kicking myself about that I didn't get to include in this story. But if I do find anything out, I'll post it onto my Instagram, so go over there and follow it. I'm at Don't Scare Claire. So yeah, I think that with so much death, it was obviously at one point a sacred place for the Celts to use it as a burial ground. Then you've got like the awful accidents with the divers and this legend of the witch. I think it is most definitely haunted. Because and then you've got like the kids' spirits and the more negative mill workers. I think again, like it's just a textbook place to be haunted, isn't it? But please do let me know what you think about the place. So thank you so much for sitting and chatting with me today. If you enjoyed this story, I would be forever grateful if you would hit that like button. And I would absolutely love to see you back here for another story soon. So maybe if you fancy it, you might want to subscribe. And if there are any other haunted places or stories that you would like me to cover, please let me know. But that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more tomorrow. So until next time, sleep safe. We've just recorded about, I don't know, a fifth, maybe a sixth of the video. Well, we didn't actually record it, so I really like this colour. I'm not sure about the applicator though. I don't like how like flexible it is.